Module 2, Historical Foundations and Evolution of Activism, Civil Disobedience and Social Movements. 1. The Ancient Origins of Resistance and Protest, Classical Civilizations. The roots of activism and civil disobedience can be traced back to the ancient world. In ancient Greece, the idea of citizen participation and resistance to tyranny was embedded in democratic experiments in Athens. Socrates' defiance of unjust charges laid the philosophical groundwork for conscience-driven disobedience. Roman Republic and Empire. Plebeians, through collective protests and secessions, challenged the patrician elites to demand fairer representation, an early prototype of mass mobilization, biblical and religious resistance. Stories of figures like Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, or early Christians defying Roman authorities, illustrate how faith-inspired resistance shaped early traditions of disobedience. 2. Medieval and pre-modern struggles for justice. Peasant uprisings. Across Europe, such as the 1381 Peasants' Revolt in England, disenfranchised groups challenged feudal oppression, asserting the right to a fairer existence. Reformation movements. Martin Luther's 95 Theses and the Protestant Reformation represented intellectual and theological resistance against authoritarian religious structures. This period foregrounded moral defiance against institutions seen as corrupt or unjust. Colonial resistance movements. Indigenous revolts against imperial powers, such as the resistance of the Zulu in South Africa or the First Nations in the Americas, highlight the global scope of pre-modern anti-colonial activism. 3. Enlightenment and the birth of modern activism. Philosophical underpinnings. Thinkers such as John Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu articulated concepts of natural rights, social contracts, and political liberty that fueled both activist consciousness and civil disobedience. American Revolution 1776, protest against taxation without representation, was not only a political struggle, but also a case of organized civil disobedience, for example the Boston Tea Party. French Revolution 1789, popular uprisings and revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity demonstrated the potency of collective civil disobedience against monarchy and aristocracy. 4. 19th century activism and social movements. Abolitionist movements. The fight against slavery in Europe, the Americas, and Africa. For example, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Olaudah Equiano stands as one of the earliest transnational activist campaigns. Labor movements. Industrialization brought about labor exploitation, sparking unionization, strikes, and socialist movements. The Chartist movement in Britain and labor strikes in the U.S. illustrated collective bargaining as activism. Women's rights movement. The Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, and suffragist movements in Britain and the U.S. challenged patriarchal exclusion from politics. Civil disobedience philosophy. Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, 1849, provided a theoretical framework, arguing that individuals have a moral duty to resist unjust laws. This essay would later inspire Gandhi, King, and countless activists worldwide. 5. 20th century global activism. Mahatma Gandhi and nonviolent resistance. Gandhi's Satyagraha movement in India represented one of the most influential models of peaceful mass disobedience against colonial rule. Civil rights movement. U.S. leaders, such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, applied nonviolent resistance to dismantle segregation and systemic racism. King's philosophy was deeply rooted in both Christian ethics and Gandhian nonviolence. Anti-apartheid struggle. South Africa. Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and the African National Congress mobilized against racial apartheid, combining civil disobedience, international advocacy, and underground resistance. Feminist waves. From women's suffrage to the second-wave feminism of the 1960s and 1970s, women globally organized for rights related to equality, reproductive justice, and representation. Anti-war movements. The Vietnam War protests, student uprisings in Paris, 1968, and global peace movements illustrated how civil disobedience scaled to international proportions. 6. Contemporary activism and social movements. 21st century. Digital activism. With the rise of the internet and social media, movements such as Occupy Wall Street, Arab Spring, #MeToo, #Black Lives Matter, and #EndSARS in Nigeria emerged, demonstrating how hashtags could spark revolutions. Climate justice movements. Groups like Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg, and Extinction Rebellion deploy a mixture of civil disobedience, public protests, and mass mobilization to demand urgent environmental action, decolonization, and indigenous rights. Activism today continues to highlight issues of colonial legacy, cultural preservation, and indigenous sovereignty. Intersectional movements. Unlike older single-issue campaigns, modern activism is increasingly intersectional, recognizing overlapping oppressions, race, gender, class, sexuality, disability. 7. The evolution of civil disobedience as a doctrine. From Thoreau to Gandhi to King, civil disobedience evolved from a personal moral stance into a mass political strategy. It has developed from passive noncompliance into organized disruptive tactics, including sit-ins, boycotts, strikes, hunger strikes, and cyber activism. The concept now spans both nonviolent resistance and radical disruptive activism, depending on context. 8. Key theoretical and practical lessons, patterns of repression and adaptation. Activism evolves as states adapt. When authorities criminalize protests, activists innovate. For example, digital anonymity, decentralized movements, from local to global struggles. Once localized protests now quickly gain international solidarity and global visibility. Legitimacy of civil disobedience. Historically, movements deemed unlawful were later recognized as just and necessary. For example, anti-slavery, anti-apartheid. Conclusion from Module 2 illuminates how activism, civil disobedience, and social movements are historically continuous struggles for justice, dignity, and equality. By tracing their evolution from antiquity to modern digital activism, we recognize that today's campaigns are part of a larger arc of human history, an arc that bends toward freedom but requires constant pressure, sacrifice, and reinvention. This historical anchoring prepares students to analyze, strategize, and participate effectively in modern movements with deeper appreciation for their roots. 6. Contemporary relevance in the 21st century. Activism, civil disobedience, and social movements have taken new forms. Digital activism, #activism, #Black Lives Matter, #NSARS, #MeToo. Climate activism, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg. Pro-democracy movements, Hong Kong Umbrella Movement, Arab Spring uprisings, indigenous rights, Standing Rock protests against pipelines. Technology has made movements more global, instantaneous and networked, but also vulnerable to surveillance, misinformation, and co-optation.